Camping had always sounded peaceful to me. Crackling campfires, starlit skies, the earthy scent of the woods. I had never been, but when Lisa and Kevin, my co-workers, invited me on a trip, I thought, why not? It was supposed to be simple. 3 tents, a weekend in the forest, and a chance to unwind. Nothing about it was supposed to be terrifying. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already sinking behind a dense wall of trees. Kevin, the self-proclaimed outdoorsman of our group, led the way down a narrow dirt trail. I trailed behind, hauling my new backpack still stiff from the store. The campsite was tucked deep in the woods, far from the main road. Towering pines formed a canopy overhead, and the ground was soft with moss. A small clearing opened up ahead, a perfect circle of grass bordered by trees. 3 tents stood waiting in the shadows, Kevin's handiwork from an earlier trip. "This is it," Kevin said, grinning as he spread his arms. "Our home for the weekend." Lisa frowned, brushing leaves off her jacket. "It's a bit quiet, isn't it?" "It's nature," Kevin replied, dropping his bag. "No car alarms, no neighbors. Just us and the great outdoors." I tried to share Kevin's enthusiasm, but something about the stillness unsettled me. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. Even the faint crunch of our boots on the grass seemed too loud. We spent the next hour settling in. Kevin showed Lisa how to build a fire pit, and I clumsily assembled my tent, sweating under the weight of my own inexperience. By the time the fire was lit and the stars began to peek through the trees, we were laughing and passing around marshmallows. "You know," Kevin said, poking the fire with a stick, "people say these woods are haunted." "Haunted?" Lisa rolled her eyes. "Come on." "No, seriously." Kevin leaned closer to the fire, his face flickering with shadows. "Back in the day, a logging crew went missing here. Never found their bodies. Some people think they got lost. Others say something took them." Lisa snorted. "And you brought us here?" "Great." I laughed nervously, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling I'd had since we arrived. There was a heaviness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. As the fire burned low, we climbed into our tents. Kevin was snoring within minutes, and Lisa muttered a tired goodnight from her tent. I lay on my back, staring at the faint outline of trees through the mesh of my tent roof. Maybe I'm just not used to the quiet, I thought, closing my eyes. But the quiet didn't last. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a rhythmic tapping, faint but steady, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on a table. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling of my tent, blinking away the haze of sleep. Tap, tap, tap. I turned onto my side, my breath catching in my throat. The sound wasn't coming from inside the tent, but just outside, near the corner where my head rested. It was too deliberate to be the wind, too steady to be an animal. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, straining to listen. My heart pounded in my chest, drowning out the sound for a moment. The tapping stopped. I waited, frozen in place, expecting it to start again. When nothing happened, I exhaled shakily and told myself it was probably just a branch swaying against the tent. My first night camping, and my nerves were already playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hours dragged by as I lay in the darkness, my ears tuned to every rustle of leaves, every creak of the forest. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I slipped into a restless sleep. The next morning, Lisa was the first to notice something strange. "Hey, did you do this?" she asked, standing near my tent with a puzzled look on her face. I crawled out, the damp morning air biting at my skin. "Do what?" She pointed to the ground. A patch of dirt next to my tent was disturbed, the smooth surface scraped away in thin, jagged lines. It almost looked like claw marks, each about 6 inches long, radiating outward in a starburst pattern. "I didn't touch it," I said, frowning. "Maybe an animal?" Kevin joined us, rubbing his eyes and yawning. "Nah, that's weird. Too big for most critters out here. Maybe a raccoon on steroids." He laughed, but the sound felt forced. Lisa didn't laugh. Raccoons don't drag their claws in neat patterns. We stared at the marks for a while before Kevin shrugged and headed to the fire pit to make coffee. Lisa and I exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of us said what we were really thinking. Something, or someone, had been close enough to touch my tent while we slept. As the day went on, we tried to shake the unease. We spent the morning hiking a trail Kevin had mapped out, the dense forest around us buzzing faintly with insect sounds. Lisa seemed to relax as the sun climbed higher, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us. It wasn't until we got back to camp that I noticed another odd detail. My tent flap, which I'd zipped shut before we left, was slightly open, just enough to make me pause. "Hey, did either of you grab something from my tent while we were gone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Kevin looked up from the fire pit, his expression blank. "No." Lisa shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "Why?" "It's probably nothing," I lied, crouching to inspect the flap. I couldn't tell if anything inside had been disturbed, but the feeling of being watched crept back, stronger than before. That night, the tapping returned. The tapping started earlier this time, before I had even fully fallen asleep. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder now, as if whatever was making the sound had moved closer. My first instinct was to call out to Kevin or Lisa, but a knot of fear tightened in my chest. What if they didn't hear it? Or worse, what if I woke them up and found out I was imagining it? I sat up slowly, the fabric of my sleeping bag whispering against my skin. The tapping stopped immediately. I froze, my breath shallow, and reached for my flashlight. The moment the beam cut through the darkness, I wished I hadn't. Something had been pressed against the outside of my tent. The material bulged inward slightly, as if a hand, or a face, had been resting against it. But by the time the light reached it, the impression was gone, leaving only the faint sway of the fabric in its wake. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the flap, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The cool air hit my face as I scanned the campsite. The fire pit was dark, the shadows deep and endless between the trees. Nothing moved. "Eric?" Lisa's voice was groggy and scared. She stuck her head out of her tent, squinting at me. "What's going on? Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, then froze, her gaze snapping past me. "What's that?" I turned, my flashlight beam following her eyes. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light, something was standing. It was hard to make out, a figure blending into the shadows of the trees. It wasn't moving, just watching us. "Kevin," Lisa hissed, her voice trembling. Kevin's tent rustled as he stumbled out, looking confused and irritated. "What's going on?" "There's someone out there," I said, keeping the flashlight steady on the figure. Kevin squinted into the dark. "I don't see anything." And then, just like that, it was gone. The spot where the figure had been standing was empty, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. "Seriously?" Kevin groaned. "Probably a deer or something." "That wasn't a deer," Lisa said sharply. She turned to me, her face pale. "You saw it, right?" I nodded. "Yeah, I saw it." Kevin sighed. "Look, it's late. Let's all just go back to bed, okay? We'll check things out in the morning." Lisa didn't argue, but the fear in her eyes matched my own. Reluctantly, we retreated to our tents. I stayed awake for hours, clutching my flashlight and listening for the tapping, but it never came back. When morning broke, the campsite felt wrong. Near the fire pit, Kevin found another set of marks in the dirt, scratches like the ones from before, but deeper now, angrier. There were also footprints, scattered and indistinct, as if someone had been pacing in circles around our tents. "These weren't here last night," Kevin said, his voice quiet. For the first time, his usual confidence wavered. "What the hell is going on?" Lisa muttered, hugging her arms to her chest. Kevin tried to brush it off, suggesting we spend the day hiking again, but the cheerful energy from before was gone. None of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We didn't have to wonder for long. By late afternoon, the woods felt heavier. The sun barely reached the forest floor, its light swallowed by the towering trees. Every step seemed louder, every shadow longer. Kevin led the way, trying to act as if nothing was wrong, but even he kept glancing over his shoulder. Lisa and I stayed close behind, walking in silence. It was Lisa who spotted it first, a cabin barely visible through the trees. "What is that?" she asked, pointing. The structure was old. Its wood darkened with age and weather. Moss crept up the walls, and the roof sagged in the middle. It was hidden so well by the trees that we might have missed it entirely if not for Lisa's sharp eyes. "We should check it out," Kevin said. "Are you serious?" Lisa snapped. "Have you seen a horror movie? This is how people die." "It's just an old cabin," Kevin said, shrugging. "Probably abandoned." I didn't like the idea either, but something about the cabin drew me in. It felt significant, like it was connected to whatever was happening. Against our better judgment, we approached. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as Kevin pushed it open. The inside was worse than I imagined. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, and the furniture, if you could call it that, was little more than broken pieces of wood. "What a dump," Kevin muttered, stepping inside. I hesitated at the threshold, a cold feeling crawling up my spine. Lisa stayed outside, arms crossed and glaring at us. Kevin poked around, kicking over debris. "Looks like someone used to live here. Or maybe squatters. Hey, check this out." He pointed to the far wall, where a crude carving had been etched into the wood. The letters were jagged, uneven, and deeply gouged. "IT watches." "Creepy," Kevin said with a chuckle, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Let's go," I said, my voice firm. Kevin didn't argue, which unnerved me even more. As we headed back to camp, the silence of the woods pressed down on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, though every time I looked back, the trail was empty. When we reached the campsite, things were worse than before. Our bags had been rummaged through, the contents scattered. My tent was collapsed, its poles bent unnaturally. Kevin swore under his breath, his hands clenched into fists. Lisa looked ready to cry. "This isn't normal. This isn't." A loud crash cut her off, coming from deep in the woods. It was followed by a low, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. We froze, every muscle in my body locking up. "What the hell was that?" Kevin whispered. No one answered. That night, none of us wanted to sleep. We sat huddled around the fire, the flames our only protection against the growing darkness. "It's just animals," Kevin said, his voice shaking. "Wolves, maybe?" Lisa didn't respond. She just stared into the fire, her hands trembling. I wanted to believe Kevin, but deep down, I knew he was wrong. This wasn't wolves. This wasn't anything natural. And whatever it was getting closer. The car careened down the winding forest road, the headlights slicing through the thick darkness. Lisa sat hunched in the passenger seat, her knees pulled to her chest, silent tears streaking her face. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, my heart thundering in my chest. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that thing chasing us. But the road behind us was empty. No sign of Kevin, no sign of whatever had taken him. Lisa broke the silence. "We left him." Her voice was barely audible, choked with guilt and terror. I couldn't bring myself to respond. She was right, but what choice had we had? The forest seemed endless, the road stretching on forever. Every shadow felt like a threat, every bump in the dirt road a potential sign of pursuit. I couldn't shake the image of Kevin being dragged into the trees, his screams echoing in my ears. After what felt like hours, we finally broke through the edge of the forest. The sight of open sky and the faint glow of the distant town brought a wave of relief, so intense I nearly sobbed. I pulled into the first gas station we found and parked under the harsh fluorescent lights. The sudden brightness felt jarring after the oppressive darkness of the woods. Lisa climbed out of the car and sat on the curb, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. I joined her, the cool night air biting at my skin. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What the hell was that thing?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, replaying every moment of the night, trying to make sense of it. Nothing fit. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. "We have to tell someone," Lisa said suddenly, her eyes wide and glassy. "Tell them what?" I said, my voice cracking. "That we went camping and something took Kevin? That we saw something we can't explain? They'll think we're insane." She didn't argue. She just buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. We sat there until the sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn painting the horizon. A week later, Kevin was officially declared missing. Search parties combed the forest, but found nothing. No sign of him, no tracks, no evidence that he had ever been there. Lisa quit her job and moved back to her hometown. She stopped answering my calls after a few weeks. I didn't blame her. I couldn't even sleep at night without the image of that pale, blank face invading my dreams. As for me, I haven't set foot in the woods since. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear it, the faint, rhythmic tapping outside my bedroom window. It always stops the moment I sit up to listen. But the worst part? When I look into the darkness, I swear I see something watching me.